welcome to a very special episode of the Creative Mysteries. This is my very first guest episode, and I'm so happy to have Jacqueline on with me. And she is a beautiful, open, feminine presence that I've always admired in her expression, in her artistry, in the sort of attunement she has to the deeper layers of beauty, harmony, and design, and what that really means for the feminine and her fullest expression and her joy. So we're going to be diving in depth into many different domains, kind of exploring this thread of where the feminine wants to take us and wants to bring awareness, and really just being completely blind to the beauty of that energy as it guides us. It's very much going to be a journey, and I'm so happy to have you here with her. Is there anything you would like to tell the audience about yourself before we dive into some of the questions I want to ask you?
Oh gosh, first of all, I love all of what you just said, and going into this blind, which of course is the feminine desire. She wants to be taken into the depths without knowing what waits her there. So thank you for that. Anything I would want people to know? This is a magical time for me. I turned 50 just a few months ago. It's going to be the 30th year of my time and marriage with my husband. We are coming up on our anniversary, and it just feels like I am finally deeply home. And I love that sensation and feel for the feminine. That is ultimately what she is seeking, is that home within herself, and then the beautiful open connectedness of experiencing that with her masculine, her man, I would say her chosen, and that's true, and ultimately it is that he has chosen her. And so I am, after all of my life feeling I was in a perpetual search for that, I am the living embodiment of that in current time, and I love it.
That feels, it just feels like such a recognizable space in the body. You're clearly so embodied in that, because it kind of like, even just your words bring forth this visceral sensation of that place. And I think honestly, being at the stage of my life I'm in now, and in this place of still discovering that home, it's very reassuring to feel that through you, because it is such a complex journey for the feminine to fully understand that place. And in fact, I think that's really the essence of what the feminine journey is about, is getting to that place of home inside of your body, where you're just so free to let go, to fully just let go of all control. And I think it's just very, very powerful to hold that in your body in the way that you do. So I want to ask you, building upon that kind of idea, what has been your journey getting to that place?
Wow. Well, it has been, first of all, a continual deepening into me. And every woman has experiences in her life that sort of offer that up to her, as though it were this beautiful buffet of her choosing to dive into these places, and the savory and the sweet, and perhaps sometimes even the sour, of who she is and what is real and what is true. For me, that has always been through a path of love. I am a lover at heart. My deepest devotion is in relationship to the masculine, and giving that to him and experiencing that. And I would say where I am currently, I sort of went through this pathway of casting off what didn't feel true and aligned to my woman, and deeper than that, to my feminine being and essence, and claimed that goddess and independence and ability to hold herself and not collapse
Yeah.
into the traumas or the all of what the world tells her to be, or her pain. That was first. And then the sort of getting to know her. And I had a very distinct vision, probably 5 years ago, where I could see the DNA, the purity of feminine DNA in her wisdom, in her beauty, in her expression and artistry, interwoven with a second strand that is the lineage she inherited from her mother and her grandmothers and the feminine collective, and that I needed to disentangle them and bring that strand of beauty and my pure feminine essence in more fully, which would then shift the energy of the sort of diverted strand of distorted feminine.
Right.
Now, what I would say is true is that I I have been going through and am in an evolution from this self-confident, independent goddess of a woman into the true submissive,
Yeah.
which is much more about her heart and her devotion rather than her strength and her power and her will and her ability to perform. It's a very different space to be inhabiting, and one that I am navigating very intimately with my husband and I call him my husband, but really he is the chosen man in my life on purpose and with purpose, outside of being my 20-year-old self who wanted to be married and wanted to have relationship with this man and a family. At 50, that feels incredibly different to be in relationship with him.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And honestly, that's something that I've always noticed about you is your connection to the sort of diamond-like purity of what it means to be a woman, totally apart from the kind of skins that we're forced to wear. And
Mm.
it's such an interesting dance between that part of us that wants to hold on to the protection often that such skins provide our smaller mind versus the sort of like the death and liberation that comes right before we're in the place where we can finally let go of those and experience the beauty. And it's like that bridge sometimes is so feels so vast, and yet it's like this constant sort of probing that brings us back to that. So it's kind of like that death, that force
Mm.
is entwined into the purity, into the divinity of that space. And I'm kind of curious to know about your experience with those deaths and what that has been like for you.
Ooh, Hurricane, you hit the nail right on the head, because when you said the death, like, that beamed in my system as such a pure truth. It's not only a part of it, it's a required experience for especially the feminine that is present now in our time. She's not the feminine of our mothers or our grandmothers, or even in my case, she's not the feminine I knew at 20 or 30 when I needed to grow up and into myself.
Yeah,
She's very different now.
yeah,
And for me, there were many deaths, and ultimately I would say I could weave all of that into the largest death of them all. And I feel I am just coming through the other side of that. Like my husband George and I, in on January 1st of 2020, immediately there was a conversation that we had, and we were preparing to divorce, and there were things I had not shared with him from deep inside my being, was fearful to say out loud. And yet, even though all our cards were on the table, we were both beginning to, I would say, strategize a not feminine experience, but to strategize how we would exit our marriage at that time of 28 years.
Mm,
And there were the voice that rang through myself was, okay, I'm aware there are these pieces I've never voiced to him, and if I don't voice them, am I sabotaging any opportunity we have to go forward? And the things that I would voice were things that would seem to be in violation to him and to our marriage. And really, I had nothing to lose
yeah.
because we were already divorcing. And yet, that still quiet knowing in myself prompted me to speak. And what I spoke was the spark that began absolutely the shift in our love, but it also began this cycle of death
Yeah.
that each of us in our own way would undergo. And my most recent, it's as though the death was happening
Yeah.
repeatedly, and yet most recently was the greatest impact of that. And that death encompassed what I have known to be spirituality, what I have known to be love, what I have known to be femininity, what I have understood the masculine role to be, who I am supposed to be in life, and how that plays out. Like it's as though, we've heard that term, I died 1,000 deaths. And it's as though in some ways I did. And yet the final death was very much like having been ravaged of and lost
Yeah.
everything that seemed so valuable. And still I'm hanging there with, that meat hook moment of Inanna, where I'm hanging there with rotting flesh, and the death digs in deeper until all of me has been essentially destroyed. And I for months just stopped listening to anything outside of myself, stopped bringing in mentors, stopped even writing. And I'm an expressionist writer by heart and write beautifully, and everything stopped. There was absolutely nothing. And as you said in the opening of this, it was my true, very potent initiation into submitting to the blindness
Yeah.
of the feminine and allowing that to be so, and to not, I'm a seer, I couldn't see. I'm an oracle, I wasn't channeling. Everything stopped in order to shift me into this new frequency and grid and paradigm of what it is to love.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's the acceptance of love beyond all fear, even when the bleakest of clouds surround you, in this sense of like what lies before me is in this, like you said, blindness is all ever present. You can still choose to love and choose to open and choose to be in this space of almost devotional vulnerability to your smallness in life. And yet within that, there's like this massive expansion of self that extends beyond any confines and kind of stretches into the very roots. And I always think about the idea of death and the underworlds as really embodied by the underground of the earth, like the soils and the roots. And it's so
Mm.
fascinating because if you look into the structures underground, there's so much life that exists that's keeping everything moving, and it's kind of goes completely unnoticed. It's these worms, it's these creepy crawlies kind of living and burrowing and pulling the decomposition down, and we take it for granted, and yet without that our world would have no foundation, and we wouldn't be able to thrive, and blossoms wouldn't be able to bloom, grass wouldn't exist. All of these things that we so take for granted exist upon this bedrock of decomposition and death and all of these hidden forces. And truly it's that letting go into that underground, into that those roots, that allows for so much more to be expressed and experienced and felt and lived. And we don't know until we get there, but it's hard sometimes because it's like it's just I mean, not even seems like, it really is like being skinned, or like you said, the meat hook, and there's nothing you can do in that moment but accept the sheer intensity of life and all of the layers of the unknown. And yet within that there's just so much profound beauty in its own way, in its own darkness. And I think that so powerfully connects to art, because in my experience every single death I've undergone has been in service to the fullness of expression that wants to come through me. And it's funny because you kind of go along this process of all these deaths, like you were saying, and you think that each time you get there you're like, oh wow, this is deep. And then you get to the next place and you're like, oh my goodness, it gets even deeper. And it's just so fascinating how much can expand simply in the sheer emotional openness that comes through those deaths. And yeah, I'm curious how you relate to the creative process within this and within the darkness and the beauty of that.
Mm. I love how you describe the underworld and being underground. And it brought to mind, sometime over the last many months, I read a piece that talked about this certain type of ant. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not here in the United States, it's somewhere else, but that they build these very complex, luxurious, stunning empires beneath the soil. And you would never know that they have these full, vast communities that are masterfully created. And so I that came back to mind as you were speaking of the underworld and the underground.
Yeah.
And having some strong Scorpio in my chart, I do not fear the death. I do not fear the underground. I find it very transformative. As for how that comes into the artistry and the creativity, you know, what's really fascinating for me is I did begin writing in December. So I knew last August, here we are now, we're nearing the end of May. In August of last year, I was very aware that I was in the throes of the deepest death I have yet experienced. And I began to write again in December. Intentionally write. I'm writing, I will write several books, but I'm currently working on the story of my husband and I and what we have been through, because there are many pieces that I believe humans at large are navigating. And there's a new template for how we do this in relationship, all of the things we typically come up against. And I began writing pieces of our story in December. And I love that you asked this, because just this week I went back and revisited what I had written and actually began to read it out loud so that it would convert from my pen and paper onto the computer. and I could then use it to create my manuscript.
Mm.
As I read what I had written, Hurricane, I had no idea how potent and how deep and how pure what had come through me truly was on an energetic level. So I would say this: even when it feels the art is not present and it doesn't feel beautiful and glorious and magnetic and pretty and charming and feminine, even in that time, the most exquisite art is in motion and happening. And for the woman who's listening, just trust yourself to create. You don't have to do anything with it until you're ready. But when it is time and it is dancing and it is moving through you and you have to get it out, just do it.
Yes, I love that so much, and I could feel the weight of all of that in such intense, almost like penetrating way, because that
Mm,
I feel that honestly it's so synonymous with the idea that we as humans can go on our merry little days, not even ever having to think about what's happening underground as the little creatures keep this world moving. And I think it's so similar with art in the sense that it's very much connected to this higher rhythm that almost in a way kind of affects you as if you were basically being grown through this nutrients through the soil. It's almost like we have this conception of art in modern times that it is this thing that we just sit down and control and create, and it comes through our will and our mind, and we can have it whenever we want, and if we can't have it, we'll just create a formula to make it. When in reality, I've always felt this true experience of being immersed inside of a project as being kind of almost shaped by this force, shaped by it's what it wants to really deliver through you. Recently, I've had the experience with a music project that I've been working on where it becomes this kind of mythical time and space as you're immersed in this project where you're holding this thing in your heart regardless of if you're actively thinking about it, regardless of if it's what you're currently working on in that moment or in this span of time. It's just this like soil that you're immersed in, and it kind of affects things around you and shapes certain events to bring something out more because this intentional creative dance has been set in motion, and there's nothing you can do about it anymore. It's just coming and flowing like this wave of the ocean. And I find that to be one of the most invigorating spaces to be in, and yet also one of the most enigmatic to trust. And it has been such a long journey being able to simply let go into the very furthest stretches of that, where the true raw art actually lives, and where that like you said, that purity of expression actually lives. And it is so much this dance between dark and light. And I think that the mythos of Hades and Persephone really accurately captures that realm, that experience, that process for a woman where she must go into this underworld that she does not control in order to experience her full reign, in a sense, as a creative force, as a creative center of life in connection to that seasonal cycle, in connection to that loss of control. And there's so much beauty and maturity that lives on the other side of that. And it can be, again, very complex to learn how to fully let go into the full experience. And so I'm curious as to how you've learned to relate to that sense of fully letting go into it, and what has led you into more trust in relationship to the process.
Mm. Wow, that's beautiful how you spoke through that. And so many things touched me. And I know from watching you from afar how potent your own art is and how deeply you immerse yourself in it. And so I do want to take a moment and really appreciate and honor and acknowledge that, with the understanding that it's part of what has quietly connected you and I in its own very magical and enchanted way.
Mm-hmm.
I would say at this point, my current expression of art and really letting go into that began in December, as I said, when I began writing. And I've known for years I'm an exceptional writer. I love writing. People are moved by it. I've known I would write books for many years. People have told me to write books. And yet you can know all of that in your being and even in your system. And you, especially in the feminine energetic, you cannot will it
Yeah.
into existence. So the biggest piece for me has been a submission, and it is a submission into even when it's not flowing, to not force it. The next submission was to sit down and begin to express pieces from an experience that I had 5 years ago that affected me deeply, affected my marriage deeply, and everything in my life. And that at the time I grew through, I healed so much of what we have known as our trauma and our ancestral inheritance. And I also strengthened in who I am as a woman. And you can hear as I'm speaking this that it was potent for me, and yet it felt my feminine, but it was actually one of those skins, those masculine protective skins that was driving me through empowerment. And no judgment of that and no regret of that. But in December, as I began writing through parts I had tucked away in order to, quote, move forward and heal and be clean and clear with myself, some emotion was still present, and some deep wisdom, even, that once I opened and allowed it to be spoken onto the page, I will call it spoken, expressed, and to come through, it's as though I cleared the channel, and then what is coming through now and what I am about to create in my next body of work is, for the very first time, my true art. I will take what I write and it will become spoken word. And it is now born of a submission to my heart, first of all, to the deep love that I have, because this will be the expression of the man I love and the way I am impacted by our love coming through me. And so this art is actually an expression of him, of who he is, of what we create in our birthing together. And it's a whole new level of submitting into what is true for me. And also this man who has chosen me and to whom I have said, yes, I give you my heart. As a child, I wrote love letters. I collected hearts. I still have a heart collection from being a little girl to this day. And the art that is coming through me now is my deepest, purest love letter to the masculine.
Wow. Oh man, it's so beautiful. I feel like there's so much fulfillment when you finally get to that place of excellence that is just so totally unwilled excellence. It's like a pure
Mm.
beingness of excellence, and it's kind of like, I feel like when we're young and we have this immaturity, we instinctively recognize that somewhere inside of us. And yet it's kind of elusive, and we try to devise all these techniques to getting there that most often, more often than not, take us away from it and kind of dilute it in potency. And really, it's just about that like ripping open into
Mm.
the experience of that excellence, that purity, that diamond like quality of what the feminine in her highest form represents. And that has, it's just such a transformative frequency. And when you finally get there, there's so much simultaneous peace and this like holding of pride and wonder at all that you are and all that you encompass. And it's just an incredibly powerful place to be and to let go into. And that ties into my thoughts that I want to bring up around, what is your idea of beauty for the feminine? What does that encompass for her, and what does that mean to her?
Ooh, I love that question. I dove deep into this, ironically, in the midst of what I knew to be my death last summer.
Mm,
And I opened a year-long creatrix salon of feminine arts, and the very first season was Femme.
mm,
And Femme was all about what you just asked, and her beauty. And the biggest thing that came through, the purest essence, is that her beauty is when she is connected to herself with an open heart,
yeah,
without so many. I think of Durga, and Durga, the Hindu goddess who rode into battle to fight the demons on a tiger.
mm,
And I heard Shamali Arda, I think is how you pronounce her last name, of the Awakening Women Institute, speak on this once.
mm,
And it was so extraordinary and impressed upon my feminine how she spoke of it. She said that Durga was on that tiger, heat between her legs, the sweat of the beast
mm,
just rippling through her being. And she rode into that battle, that space.
mm,
And I would translate that now into that love, that intimacy, especially with our man and with the masculine, with her heart open and her belly
yeah,
unprotected.
yeah,
So
mm,
we are accustomed to, if a woman's heart is open, well, she's got the solar plexus protected and she's not going to be vulnerable. If she's vulnerable in the solar plexus, her heart is protected and she's not going to be weak or open or taken advantage of. Either way, they become interchangeable and almost confused for her. So a woman's beauty is born of how deeply she is able
mm,
to be open to herself, first of all,
yeah,
and secondly, to what she experiences and brings into her world. And each woman has her own unique signature
mm,
of feminine artistry and expression. And you can't gather a group of women in a room and tell them to wear these kind of clothes and this kind of makeup and this kind of style, and then they'll be beautiful, because for some of them that won't be true. They
yeah,
won't be beautiful. It's not her
mm,
unique signature
yeah,
expression. So that beauty is born out of the deep intimacy with herself, good, bad, and the ugly, all of it. And really none of it is bad or ugly. It's all illusion in her mind.
yeah,
And then knowing her own signature, and being willing to play with that and be light about it and not get stuck in how it's supposed to look in the magazines or on TV, or the way your mom said, or your grandmother, or the ladies in the church, or the woman at the grocery store, or the beautiful sex icon that just walked by while you're out for dinner with your man and he noticed her.
Mm-hmm.
It's you. It's the depth and the expression and the adornment. Adornment is actually for sure a part of it. How she adorns her own self in her art and expression. That's the beauty, the purity of her.
Yeah.